with that, because then you have to do it twice or three times. Yeah. Welcome back. Look at a great trip. Come on in, those who are going to be in. So we're just going to do a conversation about rule of life this morning, just so folks get to test themselves whether they're in the right room or not. This is Episcopal 101.3, which is rule of life, which is the third step in having talked about history and origins of just sort of this Anglican thing. And the second course, the second session of that was about sort of the spirituality and therefore the temperament of this branch of the body of Christ. And today we're talking about rule of life. So we're going to do a little bit of process here, and it's mostly going to be, this rule of life is really kind of a wisdom in the room kind of thing to talk about, which is where folks just kind of share best practice, because there isn't a whole lot that's new under the sun in terms of those ancient practices that keep us grounded in the heart and mind of God. But rule of life really is about cultivating a rule for us as individuals within a movement that serves our own needs, for a type of prayer that works for us as we are uniquely made, a type of study that works for us as we are uniquely made, and likewise those kind of service opportunities that do the work for us that we need. So this is about sharing the wisdom in the room, and it is about, in a way, making some commitments as individuals within a community to commit to some particular practices. So that's what this is about. And the way we have shaped this entire Episcopal 101 program is with the assumption that I'm going to keep cruising. Sorry. I just want to make sure everyone can hear. And part of this is that we're filming, so if it gets captured, it'll capture background noise. So the way Episcopal 101 fits into the life of the cathedral is that we do 2 series of these each year. I think I mentioned this when we first got going. One in the fall and one in the spring. And I don't think so. Are there raccoons getting in? If raccoons come, then we'll close it. So we do this really as a new member incorporation sort of project within the cathedral community here. We'll do 3 in the fall, and we'll do another 3 in the spring. And the assumption is that while there are some folks new to the cathedral community who have come through Sunday morning, or who have come just through this, or have found us some other way, that we would have this little container for folks to be thinking about what it means to be a Christian person of faith in this particular community. And so there's an incorporation piece to this. You heard last week, was it last week? Yeah, last week on the Gather ministry of the cathedral that Mary helps coordinate with a couple of other ministers and a couple of the commissions of the Cathedral Council that were very intentional about helping folks understand the nature of this place, so that when they say yes, should they say yes, they know what they've gotten themselves into. Because the goal is that we're not then chronically apologizing for being St. Mark's, but that we've been absolutely clear and transparent that this is a place that takes prayer seriously, this is a place that takes study seriously, and a place that takes this keeps kind of dying. That's what this red light means, I suspect. Red light is usually a sign. Yes. So that's why we do this. So we also know that there are folks in the room who've been around forever. And it's helpful for us to have those two parts of the community walking together. So in the Episcopal 101.3 rule of life stuff today, let me just check real quick. How many folks are familiar with the concept of a rule of life? Familiar with the concept? Okay, maybe half the room. Of those, anyone actually have a rule of life that one would identify as a rule of life? Yeah. So where does this interest in rule of life come from? Much of the work that I did when I was first getting into congregational development was heavily interested in paying attention to generational trends. And one of the interesting findings out there was that while formal membership in while formal membership in congregations is on the decline across all denominations, there's actually an increase, particularly among Gen Xers and millennials, about this kind of notion of praxis-focused faith, right? That there's this God, that God is oftentimes in the mind of Xers and millennials radically different than the church, and that there's a way to believe in that God and to be in relationship with that God that doesn't require the function of the ecclesia or the church, right? And so there's this interesting sort of neo-monastic movement happening out there, which we can get into over beverages sometime about the pros and cons of that. But one of the pros of it, while one of the downsides is that there's some issues around mutual accountability that sometimes doesn't show up when we're doing these independent monastic practices, ironically enough. But the pro of it is that there's a real passion around doing those things to cultivate the faith that we would have assumed in this church even well before the 79 prayer book, right? So the 79 prayer book shows up in the Episcopal Church into a denomination that at the time was still primarily focused on the daily office, right? That the daily office, particularly on a Sunday morning prayer, in most places would have been the normative gathering on a Sunday morning. Eucharist would have been kind of a special occasion, particularly out west where I come from. Eucharist wasn't made normative or central explicitly until the 79 prayer book, right? So it had been moving there. Nothing shows up in a prayer book without decades of practice on the ground. It had been moving that direction, but still the official normative Sunday morning would have been morning prayer. And morning prayer, of course, is a piece of the daily office. And the daily office, of course, is the old monastic office, right? Morning prayer, noonday, evening, and compline. And there's a kind of a curiosity that's happening now where folks who aren't necessarily interested in showing up for a Eucharistic experience on a Sunday morning think in your minds Xers and millennials from the nun zone of the Pacific Northwest do nonetheless have a deep desire to ground their lives in God, right? In the Word of God in particular, which is the focus of the office, but also in the rhythms, right? Rule or rhythms of the daily office. And so there's this kind of fascinating old tradition, right? This neo-monastic tradition, the ancient modern movement, particularly among young folks, to reclaim the daily office as an essential part of a rule of life, right? So if they're talking about the prayer aspect of a rule of life, they would say, I'm a person who does the daily office, or I do a portion of the daily office, and that's how I connect with the heart of God. And they might tell you they are deeply enmeshed in scriptural study or Christian history as a study component. And what you will often hear, particularly among Xers and millennials, is that they come to all of this stuff, praying and studying, through service, right? Have folks sort of seen this tradition? They'll show up into the midst of community action, whether it's Black Lives Matter or LGBTQ work or Earth Care or volunteering at the neighborhood school or whatever the good work is, as the entry point to sort of behavioral faith, right? The faith shows up in a particular behavior, and then they sort of get engaged there. There's a sense of belonging, and then, and I'll unpack this in a second, there's a sense of belonging to the group that's doing the behavior. We backslide maybe to some prayer or to some study, or backfill to prayer and study, and then all of a sudden you've got a rule of life that started well outside the church in service, right? So if we've got this traditional, sort of the sociology of religion, starts with this idea, some folks will know this, do you know the 3 B words, right? Jay, do you want to be a partner in the traditional framework of that?
Starts with believing.
Right? That's the traditional starting point is believe. And then
Behave.
to behave.
Belong.
And then belong. Right? So that's the traditional framework of the ecclesia. That it would be assumed that folks start by getting right belief, and then in a faith community, if they share that belief and want to stick around, right, starting with what's up here, if they get the belief right and then they want to stick around, then all of a sudden they get shaped by sharing a life together. So there's a common behavior that the place assumes. It might be liturgical, it might be behavioral in the community, particular feelings around voting or around any particular issue. They behave a certain way as a manifestation of the belief that's in them. And it's through these two that they would claim a sense of belonging, right? That what they belong to is a group of people who believe and behave a certain way, right? And that this is the last piece. So this has been turned on its head in a way. And again, I'm laying the groundwork for why this rule of life stuff is kind of a thing now. The assumption now, oftentimes, and I think there's some battling about which is first, but what I tended to see, especially out in the Northwest, in the nun zone, around Xers and millennials, is that it was often actually starting with this, while we have tended to flip it and say, well, it's about belonging and then behaving and then belief might come out of that. It was actually, I was tending to see folks who would show up and they would act a certain way, doing a certain thing, whether it's service or public witness in a certain way. They would identify in that common action a sense of belonging, right? So the belonging is around behavior, right? That we all do this thing together. And out of that, we then will come to some conversation eventually, perhaps maybe, about the beliefs that undergird and inform the behaving and belonging. And to be honest, it often doesn't get to the believing piece, which is where we come in. So rule of life is about, in a way, and the reason I talk about it here, I'm just going to give these sort of an order as I've seen it, even though lots of folks will just flip these totally. Why do we then, at the Cathedral of St. Mark, talk about rule of life? Since we're a cathedral, why wouldn't we just stick to the traditional thing and just say, look, if you want to be part of this place, let's just do what we want done? Well, actually, if you're imagining the possibility that what we do here and how we do it is in some way the sort of manifestation of our evangelism, the way we meet people where they're at, I have raised a rule of life here at the cathedral since I've come as a way to express a couple of things. One, absolute confidence that God is present and active in the world around us, right? That God is doing a thing, whether the church is caught up to it or not. We talk about this now in the church often as the mission of God, that God's mission isn't held captive to the ecclesia, but that there's this mission happening out in the world, right? And that if the church has figured out how to show up and have relationships with the folks who are participating in God's mission in the world, we might in fact find that changes us as a church, and it might, in a way, give some of the behaving a sense of belonging that includes some folks who happen to be churched, right? If the belonging isn't just with folks who've said, hey, the church doesn't care about what we think matters most, but all of a sudden church folks are showing up to participate in those things that everybody else thinks matters most, then the belonging is to a bigger circle, and the church ought to be part of that bigger circle, right? So if we then get to the point of having conversations about the beliefs that have us out doing things that matter, then we get to talk about, well, how does having a life and a faith attached to Jesus have me out behaving in a particular way, right? So this is all about building relationships around things that don't presume that the Sunday morning Eucharist experience is the primary or even exclusive place where we are church. This assumes church on the move. And rule of life is something that people take with them. And we talk about missionary impulse and the pioneer spirit out in the west of the church, if you can't put it in a backpack and carry it with you on the back of a horse, it may not be essential, right? And so there's just an inherent openness to rule of life from that perspective. And we're just hearing more and more that that's a helpful place to engage people. So that's the background of why this matters here. We attach it to the Episcopal 101 series because we think it's important to help folks have a life of faith that is not just happening here. And this is a way to cultivate that and have people practice that. So when what we did just a second ago was gather information, and only a few got filled out here, but we'll do it regularly. Gather, transform, send back here on the wall. One of them was for prayer, one of them was for study, one of them was for service. And you will see these things show up regularly. And the reason we do this is because rule of life has some kind of desired outcomes attached to it, right? We do things like a rule of life because we want to increase the depth of every person's connection to the heart and mind of God. We want to increase everybody's understanding as much as possible about the nature and will of God and how to connect to that. And we want to have people absolutely clear on how they're uniquely gifted and passionate to join with what God's up to in the world. Right? Those all seem like reasonable goals for a faith community? Right? Heart, mind of God, what's the nature and will of God, and how do we get involved with what God's up to? That's the whole of rule of life. And you might note that when you think about the Sunday Eucharistic experience, you wouldn't necessarily assume that that's what a Sunday morning Eucharistic experience has as its goals. And so this makes that explicit. So we measure these things. We'll do it in the fall, we'll do it in the spring, we'll do it again next fall. We put numbers up because metrics are just kind of a little way for us to look at whether, in fact, in our own personal prayer life, have we done something in the last 6 months that has worked to help me in my own personal lifestyle figure out how to be present to God in a way that opens me up, that helps me tap into the heart and mind of God. Is there something I'm doing that's working? And again, if you're not interested in crass metrics, great. But it is a way to suggest that there's movement implied here, which is to say growth. Right? That there's a desire that we're growing in a life of prayer, in a life of study, in a life of service. So as I'm looking at this, at least of the few folks who did it, folks feel like they're praying regularly, they're praying in a way that works for me, that they feel more in tune with God through their prayer, and that they're a different person because of prayer. So they've already reached the limit of the three. They've maxed out, they've won the race. So that's exciting to see. I don't believe it, but it's good to see. And again, for study and service, it's the same set of questions, right? The goal would be that we could say, do I study regularly? And just talk about them. Well, if somebody says, I have a hard time figuring out in my life, given my lifestyle, how do I carve out 15 minutes or maybe even 30 minutes to just sit and read the upcoming Sunday's propers? Do I have anywhere in my life where I could do that? And so that's what that's about. Do I do it regularly? Have I figured out a way to study my lifestyle that works for me? Do I feel more in tune with God because I study? And am I any different because of the things I'm learning about the nature and the will of God? Again, very concrete, outcome-oriented, and measurable. And with service, I regularly serve the needs of others. I serve in a way that works for me. I'm more in tune with God through service, and I'm a different person because of service work. Again, these are just intended to be simple measurables along the way. And so, again, we'll talk about this in the spring, but the goal here is to say explicitly that the life of faith, the person who's most in charge of their life of faith is the person, right? And there's a significant shift happening here, which is to say, this isn't a service provider relationship, right? This isn't a consumer and a producer relationship, that we're all responsible for cultivating our relationship with God. And the ancient wisdom of the Rule of Benedict, from which these three movements come from, is that these are the tools that any person can practice. Right? That's what this is about. So there's a significant shift here as a cathedral, different than a parish, although many parishes are moving this paradigm as well, away from the notion that everyone shows up an empty vessel, no responsibility for sort of owning their practice of faith, but this is a shared relationship, right? That we're all in it together, we're all part of a movement, we all share what's working with us or what isn't working for us, and then we commit, and then we practice, and then we reflect, and we assess, and then we recommit. And so the rule of life is always a living practice, a living document. Fair? Questions or comments so far?
I really resonate with what you're talking about with the believe, behave, and belong, and I'd like to think of myself as quite a bit younger than I really am, but I totally get the whole behavior, really sticking with behavior, because I think that the belief part is a very intimate thing between us and God. But what I was wondering about, D. Paul, is why do you think there's a shift, one, and two, has this ever happened before? It sounded like maybe some Benedictine type stuff. Is this in this room? That's what I was curious about.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, I understand the belief, like we were just saying. It's really kind of personal between you and your belief, your God. Behave and belong, though, the question is that I have, isn't making connections with another individual a key part of the process of behaving and belonging? I mean, you really have to connect with people.
Community building.
Within the community.
Right.
Yeah, that seems like a real, I mean, I'm just sort of clarifying with my mind. Yeah, okay.
So let me do it the second first and then the first. So yes, that's if there's a growing edge with the sort of generational move here, it is that community, that these things happen together, where there's mutual accountability, I would say is a huge growing edge. And of course, I think mutual accountability is a cultural problem nationally. So I won't throw any generation under the bus. I think we're all struggling with what mutual accountability looks like. But that's not a starting point, I would say, for Xers or millennials. But it is essential, you're right, to the practice of Christian faith, that we're a body, right? All parts needing one another. So you're right, that's the nudge there. The question about how belief fits in and has this happened before. So the belief, by which I mean that sort of early process of systematizing orthodoxy has always been a specialty, right? And the question is, how do we have specialists within a body and have the whole body sort of more or less side along with orthodox? Now, this is the broadest stroke possible. That's essentially what happens at the Reformation, is that there's a narrowing of the specialists who hold orthodoxy, and then there's a movement, a public movement attached to some important historical trends that suggest maybe there's more wisdom in the room. So then the question is, if that's true, how do we sort of keep holding each other along moving forward? Like what's negotiable within the belief system of orthodoxy? That's a live conversation right now, right? It's a live conversation on orthodoxy. I'll be honest, 20 years ago, it was a much more live conversation. I'm not seeing a whole lot actually within Anglican circles talking about orthodoxy, like Spong was and Borg was a while back. Maybe if someone else is doing it, but I'm not hearing it. I think I'm hearing more conversations around orthodoxy within the evangelical community than within the sort of mainline community, which I think is fantastic. I think we're learning some things if for watching. But we have tended to move, and again, this is part of the charism of Anglicanism, that we tend to be pragmatists. We tend to be function first, right? That praying shapes believing, right? We do these things and it shapes us this particular way. And through the doing, right, through the behaving and through the belonging, we develop something about a belief about the nature and will of God and our place in that. So you're right, the question of belief is, I think that's our growing edge. Is there a mainline orthodoxy anymore? I'm fascinated to see. Maybe somewhere in the next 20 years I'll see. But that's why I think belief has been put in a third spot. I don't want to say non-essential, but I think it has been sequentialized as third in an order of three.
It's probably the least measurable of the three, right?
Could be, although theoretically, one's beliefs are manifest in how they behave and how they belong. The question is, do we articulate it in a systematic way that's shareable? Jake, how would you respond to that?
But I would suggest that not only has the order changed, but how people define those terms has changed. I think they were getting at that. Once upon a time, belief was, can I check off these particular boxes? Intellectual assent, Trinity, whatever it is. I check that box, yes, I believe that, check that box, I believe that. Behavior was, am I normally behaving sexually, appropriately as an individual? And belonging, if I've done enough formal work to become a part of this congregation. So I think the terms have been redefined.
Yeah.
And that behavior is not the narrow individualistic notion it used to be within traditional church. It has to do with how one as an individual, as a community, lives with in the community for the sake of the kingdom of God. It's a much broader term than am I behaving myself personally. And belief has come to focus not upon can I check these boxes, but what sort of an understanding do I have about God and the nature of the world? It's a much broader and richer term. Not do I have an intellectual belief in God, do I have a trust and investment in this, that God makes a difference. And then belonging, I think, has meant more than being part of an institution. And that's why checking the box to belong to an institution means less to some folk than it used to be. They can belong without necessarily checking the box. And I think checking the box to belong is important because it speaks to a commitment. But not only the order is different, I think those terms have been redefined. And I think in helpful ways, they break us out of sort of rigid notions of that in the past.
Well said. We've heard it out of the presiding bishop's office. He's talking about what people would belong to as the Jesus movement. Have folks heard this coming from Michael Curry out of General Convention? Yeah. So again, that's a notion of not only the term but the what behind the term, belonging to what. There's this notion of belonging to a Jesus movement, which again is all about this stuff, and it assumes that. The behaving isn't just the old stuff that's particularly often kind of moralistic in a very individual sense, but what does it mean to behave in the image and likeness of God? What does it mean to be like Jesus? So behavior has a particular pattern to it, which we would tend to privilege doing those Jesus things over some of the stuff that have been the demarcations of sort of denominational behavioral interests previously. And again, the belonging is this notion of belonging to a movement that claims Jesus as Lord. If anyone has studied Christian history, that is the earliest statement. There's no orthodoxy prior to Jesus as Lord. And so there's this idea that our belief, our orthodoxies can be very broad. And then we ask the question over the course of an entire lifetime, what does it mean that Jesus is Lord? Right? What does it mean behaviorally? What does it mean in terms of commitments to community of people who also believe Jesus is Lord? So that's where this is all trending. And again, the question is not is this right or wrong, but knowing that this is so, that this stuff is happening. What is the role of the institutional church in fostering that and walking along with it in a creative and helpful way, and making sure that the members of a traditional ecclesia know that it's happening and know how to talk both languages. Because that's what we're trying to do here. We're going to have to be kind of bilingual. traditional and, in a sense, ancient. So what we've got here on the tables, and this is the sort of exercise to this, is that in this room we'll have people have great service ideas or great study ideas or great prayer ideas. The idea was, and still could be, that folks just hop up, and if you've got a particular prayer thing you're doing, or a study thing you're doing, or a service thing you're doing, if you would just come around these tables and put them on there, take all of 5 minutes to do that first movement of populating the sheets, and then the second 5 minutes, everybody grabbing a sheet of paper and a pen, assuming there's enough here. And if you want to take a little time to work up what is your pray, study, serve rule of life, to start to think about a commitment you might want to make heading into Advent, right? What is a commitment you might want to make around your prayer and your study and your service heading into Advent that you could leave here with today and then spend the next month or so fine-tuning or talking with other members of the faith community about what they're doing in those areas. But this is the start of getting a little skeleton rule down, and that's the intention of this paperwork up here. So for 5 minutes, why don't we do that? Those who wish to do that and who have contributions to make, if you would do so. Everybody else is welcome to grab a sheet of paper and a pen and follow along behind them. And we'll see what comes out of the room. And then 5 after or 10 after, we'll pray our way out of here. And some will go to worship and some will go home. Fair? Right. 5 minutes and then 5 minutes. And there's extra pens on tables in the back if you need them.
King Paul. So,
So just to wrap up with the last couple of minutes, we'll just pass the mic to anyone who wants it. If there's any light bulbs on or any particular things attached here where a new thing came to you, you heard a new thing, new concept grabbed you, or you want to think about doing a new thing, this is a chance to just kind of share with the group of people we're sitting here with what you're thinking about. And it's an open mic. So who's got something they'd like to share? New ideas, new insights, anything you're thinking about trying?
I have one. Hi, I'm Lynn, and it's a no-brainer, but I haven't been doing it as studying in a group. I like that idea. I do a lot of personal study, but you don't get the other perspectives, which kind of woke me up a little bit, so thank you.
Anything this group can help you to be successful in that?
You could ask me if I'm doing it.
Okay. We'll be your accountability group. Thank you, Lynn. Any other insights, new ideas, things you want to try?
It's the times we're living in, being fragmented, and so much division, coming down from the top, that I'm moved to reach out to other faith communities however I can, and there's many ways of doing that. There's a lot of thought going on in the community now, and a lot of gatherings and events occurring that mix it up with the Muslim, the Jewish and the Christian traditions around town. So, I think there needs to be a lot of that going on to counteract this kind of hateful divisionism that's going around the country.
I think that's intentional. I think that's intended. That's not the mistake.
You're talking about politics?
Yeah, I think that's the goal. I don't think that's this by accident just kind of happened. I think that was the intentional. So that's my comment. Get us to focus on the things that don't matter.
So again, when we talk about the body of Christ as anti-society, as the sociologists say, or as counterculture, as everyone else says, there is this notion that we've got practices, that the image of the body and coming together matters, right? Just at a fundamental level, because it has political implications, social implications. Yeah, so if we can commit to getting back to the basics of coming together, that's helpful and faithful. Any other last ideas, insights, bright ideas, practices to share?
My husband's going to be shocked that I'm speaking. Let him do the job. Just what occurred to me now, though, is after the last couple of comments, is I find myself being inundated with a lot of negative. I mean, if you look at your Facebook news feed, for example, there's so much awful stuff. And I think getting back to spending a little more time on this would certainly help me be less anxious and depressed, quite honestly. I mean, so good reminders.
Feeling the very same way, this is also about caring for our souls, which we'll hear in Scripture is about giving back to God those things that are God's, right? So yes to that as huge work of the church.
I was just going to say that Brené Brown's new book, Enter the Wilderness, is an excellent sort of insight into the practices that might be helpful in moving into the wilderness of trying to treat people with respect and avoiding the dehumanization that occurs as the first step in the atrocities. Also went to see Highway's movie last night, which is incredible, but again, not necessarily uplifting. So.
Thank you for this. Again, this is crash course, some new for some new for others, but this is just a foretaste of what this cathedral community has taken seriously for the last 3 years at least, but that it's part of us. So some level of intention around these things that we do to nourish our own souls, to keep us connected to the heart and mind of God, to better understand the nature and the will of God, and to figure out how we're uniquely gifted, passionate, and positioned to join God in what God is up to. That's what all this is about: deep discernment, care of the soul, and ready to move. So I hope you'll take this stuff seriously. I hope you'll eyeball folks around the room, and if there are people that you resonate with, that you want to follow up with and maybe craft a rule with, I hope you'll do that. I'm always available to have conversation about this, but it's also deeply personal in figuring out something that fits for you, and then you try it, and then you reflect on it, and then you refine it, right? It's just a practice, just like any other practice. So this is a first invitation to get something down that you want to commit to for admin. So I thank you for hearing this. Thank you for sharing with each other openly. I'll have these up on the wall for others to hear and see after the 10:30, and we'll go from there. So thank you, those heading out. Have a fantastic day and a fantastic week. Those who are coming upstairs, I'll see you up there in about 15 minutes. Yeah, thank you all. Yeah.